My name is Christina Di Bartolo, and I'm going to be talking to you about research studies in the media. You can submit any questions that you have today by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel that's on the right side of your screen, and then I'm going to answer any questions that you have at the end of our presentation. So, who am I? So I did just say my name, that's good, but one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today with you in this webinar is how to consider the source of information that you see. This is because a lot of the time you're going to see information about research studies presented in the media, and it's really important to know where this research study came from, who is this person, why are they talking about it. So I'm going to kind of model that for you now by just giving an explanation of who I am. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of New York. Here at the Child Study Center, that means a couple of different things. One is that I'm a therapist who provides evidence-based treatments to children and families. But I also have another role here at the Child Study Center, which is to be a research project coordinator. That means that on a near daily basis, I'm thinking about research studies, helping investigators think about what their question is and how to design and run a study that best gets at that question that they have. So this means that I think a lot about how research is then presented in the media, which is how most of us tend to consume our information about research studies. So in the public sphere, most of us are not really holed up in libraries reading research studies in printed journal articles. We're basically reading this online through online news media. And so we read this usually for free. Very few of us actually subscribe anymore, it seems, to actual publications. We really just click on over to an article that sounds interesting to us and we get to read it. The issue, of course, is we know it's not really for free. What's happening is when we click on an article, advertisers are paying for that to get ads in front of our eyes. So what does this mean for research? So the issue is that we've got some really snappy, punchy headlines and then to draw you over to read an article, so they have to make something sound really interesting. Here's some examples that I came up with. They're not for research, but just in the past few weeks in preparing for this talk, of how headlines have become really sort of dramatic in an effort to get you to click over onto that headline. These words you would have never seen in a headline even just 5-10 years ago, and now you regularly will see things like rips and blasts and slams in headlines. If you're curious about my issue with breaking silence, it's that usually what will happen is you'll see that there is something happened, an incident on a Tuesday, for example, and by Thursday, the person is breaking their silence, when really it's possible that one interpretation is when something important happens, it might take you longer than 30 seconds to formulate a response. So sometimes taking some time is important. And yet, in our fast-paced technological age, people aren't really granted the time to think things through, and if they do take a day or so, it's then considered breaking their silence, as if they had been silent beforehand. In the research sphere, what this means is that studies can take years to be prepared, to be designed and executed, carried out, the data collected and analyzed. And yet now it has to be boiled down into a really snappy headline for people to actually want to click on it and read about it. So journalists are a little bit in a bind here. So what that means is it can be really hard for people to figure out when they're reading about something, is this a real research study, or is this just something that the journalist came across and it seems kind of interesting and that the public might want to know it, and so it's worth writing about. I have to confess, this article from the New York Times that I decided to put here really got me back in the fall. I was really upset to find out there might be some chemicals, whatever that means, in my mac and cheese. And so I decided to really dig in further. And this is sort of an example of what we're talking about today, is if you see something, not taking it at face value to be true and digging in a little bit. So, of course, for me, because I really desperately wanted my mac and cheese to be safe, I started to click through with links in the article. I opened up a new tab on my browser and was looking through my search engine to try to figure out what was this study, supposedly, that they were talking about that found mac and cheese could be dangerous. And actually, I couldn't find any articles anywhere, so I started to smell a rat. I actually tabbed back on over to the comment section of this article, and over the next few days, it turned out a lot of people were noticing flaws in the reporting of this. And actually, after the fact, the New York Times went back and changed the article to specify that this was not actually a research study conducted by any kind of objective outside researcher. It was a special interest group who is very concerned about chemicals, even in very, very small amounts. And they ran a study, they called it, where they basically looked at mac and cheese and saw there were some chemicals in this mac and cheese. So that's what this was. And I think it's a good example that even if you're looking at a publication which has a very strong reputation, no one is immune to this sort of clickbaiting, really fast reporting where they're not taking the time to really research the issue as much as they should before they put it in front of your eyes. We're actually going to talk a little bit about what causes someone to look in deeper and really dig into the evidence later in the talk. Okay, so let's say you didn't have an unabiding love of mac and cheese like I did. How would you have known to really look into an issue further? So I'm going to kind of call your attention back to those question words that we all learned back in the third grade or so when we're trying to get more details about something. We're supposed to ask ourselves who, what, where, and when. I'm putting together why, and of course how. So when you're reading about a research study, you first want to think about who. Who is the person making this claim? Who is the person saying that this food additive has that particular effect? And you want to think about what their credentials are. Are they a researcher? Do they actually study this? Are they a TV personality? Maybe they're the CEO of a company. I have a few examples up here of different kinds of people like that where you want to just be on the lookout. So you might think of someone who is an academic as being purely objective. First of all, no one can be purely objective. It's not a human trait. But even if they are, keep in mind academics have their careers to think about. They want to be able to publish things. This particular example over in the right-hand corner of your screen, he was a PhD student who had already been accepted to a tenure track in Princeton when it was found out that the data that he came up with for his social science study was essentially fabricated because he had a high incentive to cheat, essentially. Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos is an example where, maybe someone's not an academic, maybe they're in the business world, and they have to conduct research studies to show that their product is safe or a product actually does what they say it's going to do. They've got a bottom line to consider. So here's another example where, there can be outright fraud. And finally, you'll hear about things that sound vaguely researchy, but aren't actually research from various famous people, television personalities. I have Jenny McCarthy down here, where they might be really personally invested in the topic that they're talking about, but lack the educational background to really understand what the data really show about this idea. So you want to be careful. What is the person's incentive for making this claim to you? How much do they really understand about the claim? Next is the what. So what is this claim exactly? Research studies investigate phenomena at a really granular level, very, very precise questions, specific terms with very narrow outcomes. So that means that the results will often even involve inferential statistics. So it's not just giving you an answer, it's giving you evidence in favor of a hypothesis. That's very different than an answer. That's something that's 100% conclusive. So I really do pay attention to the way a claim is being stated. I pay more attention to a claim when the person is bringing in those aspects of probability and granularity. Here's a good example. This is a doctor who is talking about gastric bypass in pediatric patients. And you notice how precise he is. He talks about what it can and cannot do. He adds in the word probably. He says it's limited. He talks about very specific outcomes. He doesn't just sort of say generally, oh, gastric bypass is a fabulous intervention for obese children. He's really very precise about it. Anyone who talks about a miracle cure, you should just know that that has nothing to do with science. It's something else, but it's not science. Next is where and when. This is really about the context. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. One is this concept of generalizability. We would love to think that something that is true in a research study in one place must generalize or be true in a research study somewhere else. but we know that's not true. I've got a picture of Denmark here. There's an organization who looks at happiness in the world and ranks countries according to their happiness. First of all, happiness is very subjective, and a lot of social science researchers come up with other terms to try to get at it because no one knows what happiness is. But Denmark or Scandinavia, these countries are usually at the top of this particular list. Why does this matter? Well, you'll often see research studies that were carried out, very well-designed research studies, but they were carried out exclusively in one Scandinavian country. So the issue there is that we already know that Scandinavia is different from the rest of the world. Over and over again, we find this out. So how do we know if the research findings there necessarily apply to, someone who's living in the Midwest of the U.S.? It's just a very different context. I'm using Denmark as an example, but really this issue of generalizability applies all over. Also, you want to think about, is this a research study one study of a larger body of work that's been going on for quite some time? If it's the very first study of its kind, our ability to draw any meaningful conclusion from it is really very, very limited. But if there's been now 20 studies showing similar sorts of effects, this additional research study actually means a lot more than if it were completely novel. One thing I want to make you aware of is that sometimes a very old research study will be brought up again and introduced almost as if it's new. This is really something to be wary of. It means that whoever is bringing it up probably has a particular agenda in mind, and they're then using this research study to bolster a point that they're trying to make. This isn't necessarily nefarious, but in particular, if they're not clear in writing that, a study performed in 1996, if they're glossing over that or trying to make you not see that, that means that they're sort of cherry picking the evidence to support their claim, and there's probably more there. Next is the why. I have to confess this is actually quite a lot like the who question. The why is sort of the reasoning behind the person why they conducted the research study or why they're making the particular claim, what their incentive is. Baby Einstein, it's sort of a cheap shot. It's a really easy one to call out because the creator, she didn't do any research whatsoever on her product, but she made a lot of claims about what her product could do for the developing minds of young children. And once independent researchers, independent just means, not her, someone who did not have a stake in the company, once they did their research and the results started rolling in, it looked really dim for baby Einstein. Not only did it not do what she said, it actually seems like it was worse for kids' development. So at that point, the FDA will get involved and make sure that people aren't making claims that their product can do something that the research doesn't say that it can do. Now, the last one is how. This one I get really interested in because this is a big part of my job, but how in particular are we going to do this research study to answer the question that the researcher has? We call this the methods. The idea is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. There's lots of different research methods, and some are appropriate for a particular question, but wildly inappropriate for another one. So it does matter that the question is being answered using methodology that makes sense for it. So none of these particular methods that I have posted here are bad, but they're useful only in certain contexts. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of the different ways research studies can be run, but there's some common ones that you'll see. One thing I want to point out is that there's ethics involved as well. So, for example, we cannot take, nor would we want to, a human being, inject them with something dangerous, kill them, slice open their brain, and study it to see what the substance did to them. That's a horrible thing to do. We wouldn't do it. We never do it. And yet you can do that with small animals. So keep in mind, some of the most rigorous, tightly controlled research studies, ones that you would say, oh, that's the best design because it's really clear that, this substance did have the effect on the brain because, look, we injected it, can't actually be done on humans. So just because you find a particular finding in animals doesn't mean it's going to apply on the human level. And also on the human scale, I'll add, usually what happens in these studies is they're injecting small animals with huge amounts of something, amounts that no human would ever even come in contact with in their day-to-day life. And so again, that result is not really generalizable to humans. Anything done with animals in research, it's called something basic research, and it's important as a first step in investigating a phenomenon. It is important to do that kind of work, but it's not a great idea to then take those findings and apply them to your own life. This happens a lot in nutritional studies, for example. They'll isolate one particular compound or component of a food, one sort of vitamin, one micronutrient. They'll isolate it, they'll dose an animal in huge quantities, and then look at the effects. But that's just not what happens with humans. We eat entire foods, for example, and we don't eat, copious amounts of these things at every sitting. And so you really can't take those findings to mean much in terms of the human sphere. So here's some examples that I think make sense to pay attention to. An observational study is really, there's no actual intervention happening. You're not intervening on the person at all. You're just sort of observing what happens with them. Versus an intervention trial, which is where you're doing something, you're changing something. An intervention can be something as mild as hanging up flyers urging people to get tested for HIV, to something as intense as maybe a medication trial where they're trying out a medication to see if it helps them with their ADHD symptoms. So an intervention can really be almost anything, but it means you're doing something, you're trying something out. Well-designed studies will often then move toward this idea of randomization. You might have heard the term randomized controlled trial. What it means is that some people will get the intervention and some people will not get the intervention. But the thing is, you can't just have people sign up or elect or choose on their own whether or not they want to be in the group that gets the intervention or not, because then they might be different than the people who say, no, I don't want to do that. So when people consent to be in a research study with a randomization scheme, they say, I know that I might be in the intervention group, but I might not be in the intervention group. I'm fine with whatever happens. And that way we can look at the results knowing that everybody in the two groups were more or less similar at the beginning, and any differences they have will be sort of washed out by the statistics. I wrote longitudinal because if we're thinking about research studies that report on kids, it's really important that there's longitudinal data, which means the researchers tracked these kids over time to see how their outcomes were over time. Over time can be something as short as 6 weeks later, or as long as 20 years later. There are some cohorts of kids in studies for autism, for example, where they're now, they were first studied when they're 3 years old and they're now in their early 20s. That's really important because we know kids change so much over time. It really matters that they be followed. This is expensive and hard to do. That's why not all studies really include it. So like I said, there's not one design that really fits. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Not the most ideal design can be done for everything, nor really should it be, but when you do have the opportunity to see longitudinal data, you'd want to really look at that research study. The kicker here, of course, is that's actually going to be harder for media outlets to want to report because it doesn't seem interesting to them. Some study that was done 30 years ago is now reporting new outcomes. It doesn't seem that interesting. It seems like it's old, but if anything, you'd really want to pay attention to those studies. And the last is this term outcomes. So when investigators have a particular research question, they usually want to know what's going to be the outcome of something in an intervention, for example. And they have to be really precise about the outcome. So earlier when I was saying happiness is this very vague term, it is a very vague term. Most researchers will do something like subjective well-being, and they'll have their research participants fill out a rating scale of subjective well-being. And so the outcome of the study might be, I'm totally making this up, but does taking your child to the park 3 times a week have an increase in their subjective well-being? You have to decide if that research study shows that that's true, whether or not you care that these kids filled out a rating scale a little bit differently. Maybe you do, but maybe you don't. So you want to pay attention to what the outcome actually is. Sometimes they'll look at biophysiological markers, which seems like really objective, like, yeah, it's something like heart rate or blood pressure. That's way more interesting than a rating scale, but you want to look out for that too. For example, researchers will study levels of cortisol in the body. Cortisol is often called the stress hormone because we see a lot of it when people are stressed out. So maybe an intervention has the ability to reduce cortisol. So that sounds really great. But if the person doesn't also experience any subjective lessening of their stress, does it really matter what their cortisol levels are? Maybe it does, but maybe to you argue that doesn't really matter. So why your cortisol's less? If you still feel terrible, you still feel terrible. One thing that I want to bring up is something called publication bias. It's called the desk drawer phenomenon. What this means is that for every research study that you do see printed in the media, there are countless others that never made it that far. They probably never even made it to the academic journal who published it in the first place. The reason is because there is a bias toward publishing things that have what we call statistically significant results. It means that the researchers, when they ran their data, found some evidence, for example, that X does cause Y, or X and Y are correlated rather than have nothing to do with each other. These results just seem more interesting to people, and so they get published more often. Now, academic journals are trying to work on ways to reduce the effect of this bias. They're trying to publish more what I call negative results, basically studies that say, no, X didn't do anything on Y. Sorry, nothing to see here, move along. So some journals are making an effort to do that. But I have to say, from a media perspective, what you end up seeing presented to the public probably won't be affected by anything they come up with to fix it, because they're still going to want to report on those things that seem catchy and snappy. Higher paternal involvement is correlated with academic success by grade 12, making this up. But the idea is something that shows there is an effect or there is a correlation just sounds way more interesting to the public, and so that's what's going to get presented. This is really tricky because there can be plenty of other things other studies that were done that showed actually the opposite, that there was no effect or no correlation, but you're just not going to see those because they're not interesting. So because hyperlinks are so ubiquitous now, you can do a little bit of going down the rabbit hole the way I did with the mac and cheese. If you want, you can click on these links. Here's a popular parenting blog, and they include a link here that they're to the study that they're discussing. So you want to click and see if you can take a look. Sometimes you can't because these articles require you to be a paid subscriber to the academic journal. But know that if the study was funded through NIH dollars, SAMHSA dollars, anything with the federal government, they're supposed to make that article available to the public because it was your taxpayer dollars that funded that study. So what are some practical strategies that you can use while you're going down the rabbit hole? One is something called motivated reasoning. I mentioned humans cannot actually be objective. It's not possible. We all engage in something called motivated reasoning. And I did this too when I saw the chemicals in your mac and cheese. I originally had a thought, I don't want this to be true. We all have thoughts. We either want to believe something or don't want to believe something. And so what happens here is we start to look at the evidence based on what we want to be true, right? If we want something to be true, we just need to read one study in favor of it. Can I believe this? Look, yeah, I can. This study says it's true. Great, moving on. If we don't want something to be true, like I did not want my mac and cheese to be unsafe, we instead sort of implicitly ask ourselves, must I believe this? Do I really have to believe this? And we start looking around like I did, digging around, trying to find evidence that says, no, you don't have to believe this. So keep in mind, we pretty much all do this, whether we're aware of it or not, but the more aware of it that you are, the more you know where your own bias is coming from. Next point here is stand by to stand by. The fact is research takes years to complete, to get enough results in, to publish, and frankly, you want to see the same results replicated by a few different research studies before you are actually to take action on any of this. So it's a really good idea to just kind of sit tight. If you have any specific questions, let's see, you saw a research study that seemed really interesting and seemed like something that you would want to do for your child, ask your doctor. She probably does have access to the original journal article without all the clickbaity spin to it, and she's going to know your child as well, so she's going to know if the context makes sense for your child to do anything about it. So I want to see if there were any questions about anything that I can answer for you, so I'm just going to take a look at any that came in. One question that I think is important is, and I know we're short on time, but is to talk about where you can find reliable data and or research studies. So that's a great question. You want something that is going to be easy to read. So you could do something like go to PubMed, for example, PubMed, and actually go through the original articles, anything that's there. You could also go to something like the Cochrane Review. And this is something where they look at research that's done over time, they aggregate studies, they take a look and say, you know, what has the research shown over this extended period of time across many studies? What is the clinical significance of the studies, not just whether or not it's statistically significant, and, you know, should any action be taken? And so that's a really great resource as well. Honestly, if you're in a pinch, you don't have a lot of time, something seems like fishy to you or you're not sure, one of my quick shortcuts is to go to Google Scholar. So not regular Google, it's scholar.google.com. I do not own stock in Google, it just happens to be what I do. It's really a quick and dirty way to check. Type the last name of the researcher in there and a few keywords about the study and see if anything comes up, anything more than just some .com website. If there's an actual journal article, then that's great. Now you can look at that journal. Is that a real journal? Is that an actual reputable journal like the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or, you know, Archives of Psychiatry? Great. If it's not, if it just sort of links to a website or there's nothing really there, then you know that that's not a particularly reliable source of data. So when in doubt, search more, check more, look into it more. So don't accept it just at face value because you read about it in an article. We have another one here. What is the process for a research study to be up and running, and is there a review process? Yeah, this is a really important question. So for any research that involves human participants, it's subject to review by the institutional review board at wherever the study is being conducted. This ensures that the research participants are being treated ethically. So they're first going to review to make sure not only are the participants being treated ethically, but that this research study is worth asking, that it's worth even bothering anybody about to spend time and effort on it. So they're going to look at, you know, what's the overall question, and is the study that the investigator has designed the best way to go about answering that question? Or again, will it not really give you the answer that you really are trying to find out? The institutional review board on the institutional level will absolutely make sure that they're there to make sure that the study has to be run ethically and in a way that makes sense. If in particular the investigator is applying for funds from the federal government, there is an extensive review process. The word extensive is putting it incredibly mildly. Funds are really tight at this point for research studies. I know it might not seem that way, but compared to even just a few decades ago, it's extremely difficult to get federal funds to run a research study. And so if anything is funded by the National Institutes of Health, it went through an extremely tight review process for all of those things that I mentioned that the IRB brings up, but just in general, is this an issue that's going to actually be helpful to the public? So that's something to keep in mind as well. So on behalf of the Child Study Center, I want to thank you for joining me today. When you leave the webinar, you will receive a survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you would complete that. You'll also receive a follow-up email within a day or two with a link to the recording of today's presentation. We really hope you can join us for our next webinar, Healing Trauma Through Parental Self-Care. That's with Mary Dino, LCSW. That webinar will be on Tuesday, April 24th, also at 1 p.m. Thanks again for joining me. Bye.